My name is Stephen Bakker. I work for AMS-IX, and today I'll be talking a little bit about Proxy ARP Detection and IXP Peering LAN. So for this exercise, if you want to calculate along, you would need a pencil and a piece of paper, some way to calculate IPv4 subnets, and some random generation things, hosting a peering LAN and the ARPing command. So if you don't have that, then well, you'll just have to listen to me. So why this particular presentation? Well, about 10 years ago, almost on the dot, AMS-IX suffered a proxy ARP event that resulted in pretty much a meltdown on the peering LAN. And at that point, we realized that we needed to put additional controls in place to prevent this from happening again. And the reason why I'm giving this presentation is that we recently enhanced those controls, so they should be even better in detecting proxy ARP. So a quick refresher on proxy ARP. I am hoping that everyone who's listening at least knows what ARP is. If not, then I think you should go to Wikipedia. So the Proxy ARP Refresher is basically a proxy server on a given network answers ARP queries for an IP address that is not on that network. And the proxy offers its own MAC address as the ostensibly final destination. So this may look a bit obvious, but what's the actual problem on a peering LAN? Because as we saw in the definition, proxy ARPers typically only send ARP replies for addresses that are not on the peering LAN. And BGP routers typically only send ARP requests for addresses that are on the same network. So proxy ARP on the peering LAN would seem to be pretty harmless. However, in practice, you should reread that first sentence and think proxy ARPers only send ARP replies for addresses that they think are not on the peering LAN. And that's because misconfigurations can lead to a confused router. So if you have the wrong network prefix on your peering interface or the wrong prefix length on the peering interface, and you have enabled proxy ARP, you may in fact start to answer for addresses on the peering line. And if that happens, things can go very wrong. Now, there are many reasons why this could happen. What we've seen is the case where we renumbered the peering LAN prefix, and not all customers' routers have migrated to the new peering prefix. We also have seen the case where we put ports in quarantine before putting them in production. They get a temporary address on that. We test, everything seems to work fine. The port moves out of quarantine, so we put it in production, but the customer has not changed the IP address on their peering interface yet. If that is combined with proxy ARP, it can again lead to a disaster. So a bad prefix plus proxy ARP can pretty much certainly cause a black hole. So over time, it will poison the ARP caches of the peers. Whenever they start ARPing for their peer, they will receive probably two answers, and whichever one comes in first will win, which results in traffic to be black holes and BGP sessions to die. Depending on the ARP cache timeout. Sorry, did someone say something? No, okay. So depending on your ARP cache timeouts, that can be slow or quick. At AMS-IX, we typically recommend ARP cache timeouts of 4 hours, also to reduce regular ARP rates. So it takes a while before this happens, but when it happens, it's always painful, and the recovery time can be very long. So what we need to do is early detection. The earlier we detect it, the sooner we can remedy it. Now, there are ways to prevent it as well, which is using inbound ARP filters on customer ports. And we would really like to do this. The only issue is that it's not available on all platforms, and our platform doesn't fully support ARP filters on customer ports. So the only other option we have here is to do mitigation. And that can be done by checking very often, using long ARP cache timeouts, as I said. That will reduce the speed with which Proxy ARP brings down a peering LAN. But it can also slow down the recovery of ARP cache poisoning. And the other thing that we have used in the past is to use automated tools to unpoison ARP caches. So once a proxy ARP event has poisoned the ARP caches, you can send out unsolicited ARP responses to try and get the caches in a decent state again. So proxy ARP detection method 1 is fairly obvious. During the port quarantine, we send ARP queries for a few well-known external IP addresses. So that's IP addresses that we know are not on the peering LAN. So I just listed a few, including a little bit of RFC 1918 space. And that usually works very well because anybody answering for those ARP queries is obviously running proxy ARP. And we will not move the port to production until that has been shut off. The problem is that there's no guarantee for what happens once a port goes to production. So there's method 2, which is, apart from the quarantine procedure, we also probe for ports in production. And in the peering LAN, we will send our queries for, again, those few well-known IP addresses. And again, anyone answering is obviously a proxy ARP. When we see that, we raise an alarm and or disable the offending port. There's one problem with that, or a limitation with that. It doesn't really distinguish between harmless and fatal proxy ARP. So what I term harmless proxy ARP is if you indeed only answer for IP addresses that are not on the peering LAN. Normally, nobody would query for those IP addresses, and so you wouldn't answer for them, and it's really harmless. But the fatal proxy ARP is when you start answering proxy ARP requests or ARP requests for addresses on the peering LAN that are not your own addresses. So because we cannot distinguish in this, and because it is something that we have seen regularly in the past, proxy ARP, a simple annoyance could result in red alerts. So if you see suppose you see 2 of those alarms raised, you wouldn't know which one is the dangerous one. And that leads us to method 3, where we use the same method as before, but we also send ARP queries for unused addresses on the peering LAN. We always have a few addresses lying around that are not being used. So anyone answering for those is either a proxy ARPer or an IP hijacker, or in our case, also the ARP sponge, but that's easy to exclude. That has its own limitations. You may, first of all, not have spare IP addresses on your peering LAN to do this. And it may still fail to detect harmful proxy ARP. Because if your tested IP address actually fits in what I would call the offender's notion of a local prefix, it would not answer. So suppose you have a /23 prefix on your peering LAN, and your proxy ARPer has configured a /24, and his IP address happens to be in the lower half of the /23, then if your test IP is in that same lower half, then it will not trigger the proxy ARP. So you can catch some of the bad cases, but not all of them. So for a proper detection, we started thinking, well, if we want to do this properly and not just use it as a heuristic, it has to be something that works for both quarantine and production LANs. It does not require a free or reserved IP address. And it should work for both cases where someone has configured the wrong prefix and the wrong prefix length, and or the wrong prefix length. So The short version of this is the solution would be to split your peering prefix in two. So in your test environment, you split the peering prefix in two. So take a /23 and turn it into two /24s. Then from each subnet, resulting subnet, you would pick two random IP addresses, and you send ARP queries for each of those 4 addresses. And if there's any device that answers for 2 or more of these IP addresses, you found a harmful proxy ARP. The proof as such, or the reasoning behind it, is because an offender, so someone with a wrong prefix or prefix length, who has configured a prefix, will have that prefix either be outside the peering prefix, so completely outside the peering prefix. It's somewhere in the lower half of the peering prefix if it overlaps, or it's somewhere in the upper half of the peering prefix. And a choice of random addresses basically guarantees that at least 2 IP addresses will be outside of the offender's prefix. Now, the offender will then send proxy ARP replies for at least 2 addresses. That's the basic idea behind it. So I included a few examples of how this would look. So in case 1, the customer has configured the correct prefix, /21 in our case, and has configured proxy ARP, but basically if we start testing, all the test addresses, the 4 green dots that you see are the 4 randomly chosen test addresses. They all fall within the customer's peering prefix or configured prefix, and so he will not send any proxy ARP replies. So this is what we consider to be harmless proxy ARP. Now, if the customer has a prefix that is completely outside of the peering prefix, then in this case, they, for example, still have their quarantine IP address configured. Then we again pick 4 random IP addresses, 2 from the lower half, 2 from the upper half. And since they are all completely outside of the customer's configured prefix, it's very likely that he will proxy ARP for all 4 addresses. And this is actually what happens to us on the event of 11th August 2011. That was a bad day at M6. Now, let's suppose that the prefix length is off by 1. Then you have a peering prefix, again, that's a /21. The customer has configured the correct address, a network address, but the wrong prefix, so that's a /22. And in this case, they fall in the upper half of the peering LAN in that case. So again, we pick 4 addresses, 2 are in the lower half, 2 in the upper half. The 2 in the upper half will not trigger a proxy ARP reply because they are in the same subnet as the customer has configured. The 2 in the lower half will actually result in 2 addresses being proxy ARP. The next case is when your prefix length is really way off. So /21 should be correct. The /24 is what's configured. It somewhere falls, somewhere in the upper half, but only a tiny fraction. And we start with our 4 random addresses. So you will typically see, in this case, none of the IP addresses falls within the customer's configured prefix. So it's likely that he will answer for 4 addresses. In this case, it could be 3 as well, if one of those addresses happens to be in his prefix, configured prefix, or if both of the random addresses in the upper half happen to fall within his prefix. So you would get either 4, 3, or 2 addresses that solicit an ARP reply. And this is why we said if you see 2 or more replies to, if you see a device replying for 2 or more of these addresses, that's when you have a dangerous proxy ARP. And there's a little bit on how we implemented it at AMS-IX, which is not that difficult. So we said quarantine ports cannot go into production until all proxy ARP has been resolved. That's easy for us to test. And then in the peering LAN, every 3 minutes at this moment, we check for harmless proxy ARP in the peering LAN. Again, this is testing for Microsoft and Google and Cisco IP addresses. And if we see that, we open a ticket and we send nag mails to the customer. But it's not an urgent thing. It's something that should be solved, but doesn't bring down the exchange. And then next to that, we also check for the harmful proxy ARP. And if that happens, we recently, I think it's about a month ago, we configured it to actually disable the port, open a ticket, and raise an alarm. And up to now, since 2011, we really only found a few harmless proxy ARPers. So for now, we kind of feel safe, but you never know. Anything could still happen. And most of the proxy ARP that we found was during port quarantine. So in conclusion, and I think I have a lot of time left, sorry for that. In conclusion, proxy ARP on a peering LAN can potentially be fatal. And in absence of adequate ARP filtering, early detection is absolutely crucial. Checks during port quarantine, so during port connection and setup is already quite helpful, but you still need to do frequent checks in production. And I'm available for any questions, and that was my presentation.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Interesting presentation. So looking at the chat, we don't have any questions in the chat here. Do we have any live questions?
There's a question in the chat from Alexi, and he says, do you have adequate ARP filtering now?
No, unfortunately not. We're looking at, we are in the process of no, we've already found a vendor, but we are planning on changing our platform vendor in the coming period. And the new platform will include ARP filtering possibilities. I mean, that's obviously always the ideal way to do it. And to be honest, if you have that ability on in your software, you should use it, because you know exactly which IP addresses you handed out to which parties, you know behind which ports they should be, and you probably also know which MAC addresses they use. So ARP filtering, if you have it available, I would say absolutely turn it on. Yeah.
Okay, Stephen, there is a follow-up question from Alexi as well. How many vendors did you evaluate for the ARP filtering?
I couldn't say that specifically, because we, when we looked at vendors, new vendors for our platform, we had a long laundry list of demands and features that we wanted. And ARP filtering was one of the, well, I would say highly desirable features, but it wasn't the most crucial one. So I couldn't say how many were actually evaluated specifically for ARP filtering.
Okay, thank you. Any additional questions?
Oh, one thing that I said, because I say we do it here for IPv4. You could, in principle, also do it for IPv6, where you would send out neighbor discovery queries, and we do that as well. But we've, in practice, we've never seen anyone that had proxy ND configured. Also, because that is something you have to turn on explicitly. So you have to explicitly turn it on and configure it, while Proxy ARP in some routers for some vendors is sort of a default turned on thing. And that's why it's so dangerous.
There's another follow-up from Alexei. Subnet sizes are easier to get right on IPv6 too. Not question, comment.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.